All right, we have to check all of the settings, and I'm also going live over on TikTok, so give me a moment. What are we doing? Polyglot. Let's talk about language learning. Languages. One second. That's good. And the stuff that I do last minute, it's okay. It is okay. We are good. Okay. I realize it's a lot darker on this than it is on my computer, but that is okay. That is okay. What I can do for myself is this. So if you are joining me, hello, while I get all of the things set up, and I'm also going to triple check my audio to make sure it's all good. Yeah, all good. That is too much light, but that is fine for this. There we go. Perfect. We are good to go. All right. So I am trying to do this whole thing where I am consistent with showing up either live or with a video. And I also thought it would be really great to do this specific topic today because this is just me thinking about future me. This is something that, because it's such a broad topic, broad meaning like we're talking about a lot of things today, that I feel like I can break this up into smaller bite-sized pieces for the channel so future people can watch it. So if you don't know who I am, first off, my name is Bront'e. I am a language coach. I help language learners go from frustrated to fluent in multiple languages, primarily in my community fluency mastery lab. That is where I give language coaching. We have an entire roadmap of walking people through from frustrated to fluent. And we redesigned it maybe a few months ago at this point, where now it is 3 different pillars. So the pillar is strategic planning, fluency practice, progress reflection. And those are really the 3 things that you want to focus on in your language studies to consistently make progress and improve your skills so you can start using the languages that you're learning. I also have a whole separate thing where I teach people how to build that consistency and like exactly how I do it. Now today, we are not diving into those specific topics. Because I could talk about that for hours. What I did want to touch on though was, and I actually have I realized I wasn't planning on wearing these. I wanted to touch on basically different study tasks. So if you're on YouTube, you already see it from the thumbnail and the description. And if you're over here on TikTok, you probably don't see it. It just is like, let's talk languages. But I wanted to kind of dive into something I feel is really important to recognize and unpack when you're learning multiple languages. And to break it down really simply, you can either say it's like a language approach or different types of study tasks. I talk about this quite a bit, and I figured why not do it live? So if you are joining me live, thank you. I am looking at both chats. So if you have questions while I'm chit-chatting, feel free to. This is kind of like improv in a way. Like I have things I want to talk about, but generally I'm just here to support people. I already see. It is so funny that you brought up input output because that plays a role into exactly what I want to talk about today. What is more important, input or output? How can we become fluent in a language, and how much listening skills is a significant skill? Is it considered the most useful skill? So many questions, and I think part of what we're going to do today is dive into it. I'm going to quickly answer, and then I hope that the conversation that we have today is going to answer that even more. So really what it comes down to, first question about, is input or output more important? They're not more important or less important than each other, but they play a role in your overall understanding and being able to use the language, because input is your listening and your reading, output is your speaking and your writing. And the importance of it really depends on your goals and your habits. I always call them, the thing that we focus on is guiding principles. So that's like your why for learning languages. And so if your guiding principle is wanting to be able to read in a language because you have books on your shelves that you really want to read, you want to, or you need to do that, then your priority is input skills. It is reading and comprehension. It's not necessarily speaking and writing. So for you personally, that would be more important. I think it's really subjective, which ones. When it comes to being fluent in a language, the thing that I tend to tell everybody that I work with is first start defining what fluency means to you. Like, what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And then it takes kind of what we're talking about today, these different ways of practicing, studying, reviewing what you're learning, because a lot of people focus on the studying that they forget the practice of the languages. And then you talked about listening skills. I would say listening is important, but again, it depends on your guiding principles. And then is it considered the most useful? Again, depends on your guiding principles. A lot of times it really depends, because learning languages is a personal experience. Some people learn languages, for example, just to be translators. They just want to be able to understand the language and either write translations or speak translations. If you're just writing translations, I have friends who have become translators for like Spanish and for Japanese and for Korean. They are not confidently fluent speaking the language, but they are confidently translating the language, and it's a completely different skill. So I really think that it depends. But I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's literally on the same page of what we're talking about today. I'm actually going to switch this over here and then this here on my screen, I think, so that I can see the things that I want to talk about. And so what I tend to talk about with my members is we actually have a specific lesson on this inside of the membership, different study practices. And so when I'm choosing a task for my language studies, I usually think about it in a couple different ways. I think about practice tasks. So how am I practicing the thing that I've just learned? It's all about solidifying the information. It can be an intensive practice, so you're really intensely focused on it, or extensive, meaning you are doing lots of things to get the exposure, to get the immersion of it. I think about study tasks. Am I learning something new versus practicing the thing I've just learned? Review, which is like recall or recognition. So am I practicing recalling things, so in my mind pulling it out so that I can use it in practice? And a lot of people actually overlook that skill. Or am I practicing recognition, which is really about being able to see it and know, is this the thing or is this something else? And these are all different parts that I want to dive into and break down for all of us. And then we have things like passive learning and active learning, all really important to the overall sort of language learning process. So passive, meaning you're not really putting any effort into it. It's kind of, you can think of it like immersion in a way. Whereas the active practice, you are really intensely focused on doing the thing. You are sitting down with a purpose, with a goal in mind, with the task that you have. Now, I want to dive into all of these, and in particular, things like passive versus active practice, recall versus recognition, extensive versus intensive learning, to really help you identify which of these do I need right now to help me make more progress. Because what I've noticed is that many times in our language studies, we might focus, for example, a lot on intensive practice. You're really intensely focused on this one textbook and you're spending a lot of time on this one chapter, when what you really might need is extensive practice. You just need a lot of exposure. You need to skim and read lots of things and get the gist out of it. You don't need to understand every individual word in a book or in a conversation. And knowing the different options that you have really helps you to take control of your language studies. And so one of the things that I really like to do is to really think about my guiding principles, about the goals that I'm trying to reach. And most of the time I call those milestones, and the habits that I'm trying to build as a language learner. Like, what kind of person do I want to be as someone who is fluently using these languages? And that comes down, that will help me to create my schedule. So for example, let's start with passive versus active practice. I tend to do a lot of passive practice when I'm maintaining a skill or maintaining a language. So, for example, right now in my own language studies, I'm in the third month of the quarter for actively focusing on German, Russian, and Italian. German and Italian are my baby languages, they're brand new. Russian is one that I have studied off and on and is probably the hardest language that I am currently learning to this point. And those take a lot more active practice. So I'm actively on an app. I use things like Linguist and Lingodeer, and I'm on websites studying, and I'm taking notes, and I'm reviewing content, and I'm practicing out loud, doing my sentence building. Like, I am actively studying those. But the other languages that I have on my list, so Spanish, French, Japanese, Korean, Mandarin, for example, to a lesser extent, American Sign Language and Black American Sign Language, like those are maintenance languages. So I'm listening to podcasts and I'm just listening. Or, more likely I'm playing a video game that I really love, but I've changed the language into Japanese. I am passively studying Japanese in that case. I'm maintaining my skills in Japanese. And so it's really important to know those differences so you can know, what kind of task do I need right now to achieve the thing that I'm trying to achieve? Do I need active practice? Do I need to really focus my time and attention on this? Or do I need something a little bit more passive just for the exposure, just to maintain what I've done? And so I see right now, how can we increase our vocabulary so you'll recall it easily whenever you want to speak? Okay, so increasing vocabulary, you need more exposure to vocabulary, and you need, what I recommend, I won't say need, what I recommend is vocabulary in context. So one of the resources that I love, and I literally created it for myself, it's my sentence building process. And I always talk about learning vocabulary in context, because if you see a word in isolation, it's really hard to know how to use it unless you get these example sentences. And even better, if these example sentences are from native speakers in the ways that they've actually used it, and not like a translation or just like a generic sentence, right? And so having those words in context helps you to increase your vocabulary. And you can even take that a step further with sentence building by taking a sentence and replacing the words with new words, and watching how people use the same sentence structure but replace it. So if you're saying, I'm going to the store, you can take out store and replace it with to the park, and you can take out park into the hospital, and you're learning these new vocabulary words in context. You know that the comes before them in certain dialects, and maybe in another one it doesn't, but you're learning how to use it in addition to actually learning what the word means. And then in terms of recall is about pulling the information out. And so you might notice recall being pushed, or like you actively focusing on recall, for example, in apps like Duolingo, Lingodeer, any app that has like flashcards, but it leaves a blank space, and it might ask you to type in the words, right? It doesn't give you a list of words to reference so that you can process of elimination, figure out which one it is, or recognize it when it's written and go, oh yeah, of course that's the word for letter, right? It's asking me to put letter in that blank space, that's the word for letter. Rather than having those options, the recall happens when it's blank, or even when it's letters, and you have to learn how to, or practice how to spell the thing. And so if you're trying to increase your vocabulary, I would it depends if it's a study task, a practice task, or a review task. If it's study, I would definitely focus on studying the words in context. I would try to find books and videos where they're using the theme of that vocabulary. If I'm focused on food, I'm going to find videos where they're talking about food, talking about cooking. If I'm focused on technology, I'm going to find videos and podcasts and texts and articles that are talking about that, even if it's a little bit more challenging for me, because I don't have to read the whole thing. I don't have to watch the entire video. I can watch 1 minute of it at a time. I can read one paragraph at a time, or even one sentence at a time, and take my time with it. That would be the extensive process, or the extensive study, where you're taking it bit by bit. You're coming back to it again. You're coming back to it again. And that's how I would kind of study, just off the top of my head. When it comes to the practice, I would build sentences. That is probably my go-to strategy for building vocabulary and getting more comfortable, confident with vocabulary and grammar. It is not just, writing the word out on a sheet of paper, because I definitely did that for Spanish back in middle school, high school. I did that for Mandarin as well when I was studying. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes just literally writing out the same thing over and over again is very helpful. But in the case of learning the vocabulary, it's not always as helpful when the goal is to recall the information and also make the connection in your mind between the word, whether you hear it or see it, and the meaning of it, the meaning behind it. That comes from using it. That comes from seeing it over and over again in context. So that when you see the word blue, BLUE, you know that it's the color, and they're constantly using it to describe the color of something. Then you, in your mind, are able to make that connection that it's a color and it's describing something. It's used to describe the visuals of something. It's a description. And so then when it comes to like a review, I think honestly I would use sentence building for that too, but it really depends on what works best for you. One of the things that I say to my members all the time is that like what works in theory doesn't always work in practice. And so even with me giving my personal preferences for strategies, usually when I'm in a like coaching conversation with people, we're diving into what works. I might share what works for me, and we're choosing something based on their needs and their experience with languages, and based on strategies that have worked and haven't worked for them, and we adjust that as needed. So there are tons of ways to do it. There is no wrong or right way. There are just ways that generally work better for most people, ways that work best for some, and then ways that work best for like a unique few. And the only way you're really going to know that is by trying it out and testing it and adjusting as needed. So according to your knowledge, I love these questions, by the way. Any dictionary you prefer to see any word, which is a meaning bilingual. Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good question. At some point, I like to switch to a monolingual dictionary. I don't start there because it's overwhelming depending on the language, but I like to do monolingual as soon as I can, even in small bursts. And actually, how I use it to sort of ease myself into it, there's a couple different strategies. So for example, if I'm looking in a Japanese dictionary, Japanese only, I look up a word that I just read from a text, and then there are words in the definition that I don't know. I unpack those words in the definition. I pull them out. I look those words up. Sometimes it becomes a little bit of a rabbit hole. And so this is like a separate strategy or an activity than the reading. It's less focused on the reading than it is on the vocab, because it can get frustrating to find a definition and go, okay, there's 3 words I don't know. And then you look up those 3 words and you're like, there's 3 more words that I don't really know. So I think you want to be strategic with that. But the other option is I do use bilingual, but I use it without my native language. So there are apps like word references. There's another one that I'm forgetting the name of right now, but there are a couple that have like multiple, and I think it's more common now, multiple options for dictionaries. And so rather than doing like Korean to English, I will do Korean to Japanese. And so I will look up the words that I don't know in Korean in Japanese. Now, if I don't know the Japanese word, then I might look it up in English, or I will do the alternate that I shared, which is looking it up in Japanese again, looking up the words I don't know, and creating my own word list. And I can write down those sentences from the dictionary. So the definitions, those are sentences. Like, this is a dictionary that people who speak that language use. So it's not sort of awkward sentences. It might be a little more formal because it is a dictionary, but they're not really necessarily awkward because this is what people reference to understand their own language, right? Like, people can go to Webster Dictionary for English or Cambridge, for example, and look at those example sentences and generally just go, yeah, that's a sentence that makes sense, right? I might not use it that way, or someone else might not use it that way, but it is a sentence that is grammatically correct, that has been used by people who speak the language. So, yeah, I generally do monolingual, but I don't emphasize one or the other for anyone that I work with. A lot of what I do is doing what works best for you as a language learner. And again, your like guiding principles, what you're trying to achieve. But ultimately, I think we do, as language learners, need to shift from using either our native language or another language while we're studying this new one into just strictly that language. So at some point, you do want to get yourself so immersed in the language that you're learning that you don't have to always rely on another one to understand, because there are certain things that we learn in these languages that don't really have a translatable, like, don't have a translation. And if you've ever done translation before, if you've ever had to try to express the thing that you would say in your native language to another language, you're like, how do I? Because if I say it exactly piece by piece, that's not the same meaning. Or, there's certain words. I think of words in Japanese, for example, like kuchi sabishi is like your mouth is sad. It doesn't literally mean your mouth is sad. The way that it would be translated is like, it's like you want to eat food, but you're not hungry. But that's not a word in English, right? Kuchi sabishi is just, it's Japanese, but it's not an English word. And so at some point, you get yourself immersed in the language to hear that phrase in context, to where your brain doesn't have to translate it, but instead it understands the context that it's being used in. It's bringing up those situations the same way that you would do in your native language. And the ways that we do that is by deciding which tasks to focus on. So for example, if you are, we talked a little bit about active and passive. And so I'm going to give some examples of active practice versus passive practice, just so that you get a better understanding of like what the differences are if you've never heard of these things before. So passive study, for example, is like listening to a podcast while you're commuting to work. You're not taking notes on the podcast. You're not pulling out vocabulary. You're just listening. You can even make this passive study intensive, where you're listening to it on repeat. So you listen to it once on your commute, you repeat it, you listen to it again on your commute. You're not actively studying it. It's still passive, but it's also intensive because you are keeping with the same content for a repeated amount of times. Versus if you are actively practicing, you are maybe having a conversation with someone, or you're using that same podcast, but now you have your notebook in front of you and you're taking notes. So you're like, pause. Okay, there's a word they just said. Let me write that down. You can actually look it up in the dictionary now. You can do it later. You can turn that into sentence building practice. You can turn that into write what you learned from the podcast. There's so many different ways you can transform that listening into active study, either during the listening or after. But the passive studying is really just listening. And you can also do extensive listening with this work by listening to, basically, if you have a podcast series, listening to multiple episodes in a sitting. You have one on, you listen to it, you get the gist, you move on to the next one. You listen, you move on to the next one. This is still passive. You're just listening, but you're listening to multiple things versus just listening intensely, repeatedly to one. Intensive is like focused, and extensive is like broad and multiple. It's more about the immersion and getting a lot of content into your brain, right? Into your brain, into your ears, into your eyes, like a lot of exposure to the thing. And so you could do that same extensive listening and make it a active study session by listening to lots of things. And every time you finish, you just write down a quick summary. What was it mostly about? Now you're actively trying to recall the information. You write it down. Okay, next episode. You listen. Maybe you're writing down vocabulary. And then what was this one about? Got it. Next one. And you're not repeating them. You're not repeating these podcasts. You're not repeating the listening practice again. You're constantly moving to new content so that you can get the exposure of lots of different information. Because even in our native language, or I guess especially in our native language, when we're listening to content, reading things, sometimes we're not listening to every individual word. Like you listening to me right now might be skimming over some of the words that I'm saying. Or when you're reading a book, you might be skimming over some of the words that you're reading. And so in extensive practices, extensive tasks are really important to the process of being able to consume and understand and internalize what you are reading, watching, listening to. Okay, we got another question. Which is better to use, the dictionary, the online dictionary, hard copy? there is some merit to using like a hard copy dictionary because it's right in front of you. You don't have to rely on technology. But I do think, especially nowadays, like if you asked me this 2012, I would have said, there's not, like, maybe I would do both. Now I might say, depending on the language, online, because it's regularly updated. And I would even say because there's more opportunities to get those example sentences, and even for certain languages, get the examples of how people are using it in media, online, in the news, in articles. So for example, I'm thinking specifically about Korean. I know that the Korean dictionary, the Naver dictionary, when you look up a word, and this is a very unique thing to this dictionary, I don't think many of them do this, but when you look up a word, it gives you the definition and sentences, but then it also gives you Korean media where it was used, and it gives you the quote, and you can actually listen to the audio of a person who speaks Korean using that phrase or using that word in the sentence that they gave you. And I think there's something really powerful to that, and the fact that we get this updated information. But I think that what I would do is go with online first, especially because online is free. Like if you don't have to pay for a hard copy, I wouldn't. And because yes, there's tons of vocabulary in the printed ones that is still, to date. But I think that unless you were like, I have to have a physical copy in my hands, I don't work well with having to constantly look up things on technology, I would do the online version. And that's just a personal preference. I think it's really a personal preference, up to some point. But you will have to go online at some point to look up some things, because you might find even more ways people are using it that wasn't even printed into the dictionaries, or ways that it's being used colloquially. So like, in conversations with actual people, but is not really the dictionary's way of showing you how it's used. So I hope that clarifies. So passive and active, I hope that that kind of makes sense. And then we talked a little bit about intensive and extensive practice when it comes to learning languages. And so intensive, as I said, is like really focused on, it's like an in-depth study session. You are, if you have a textbook, like actually I'm gonna pull this one. This is not necessarily a textbook, but it is a book that I can reference. So this is a book that I have. I got it from like Book Off or something. And this is actually a comparison book. So it says Furansugo, Italiago, Spaingo, and it's like a like Manaberu Hon. It's a study book, right? Inside this book, it shows you a comparison of all three of those languages. Sometimes the sentences are not correct. I'm going to say that. But this is something that I could do really intense practice with. I can go to, let's say, I'm going to find, this was not planned, but so there's like, they're by chapters. So I can go to chapter 2, which is all about, what is it? Hatsu? Yeah. I don't like that chapter. Let's see. Okay, so like meshi no, so this is like nouns, right? Nouns about self. I can go to the chapter for nouns about self, and I can spend several study sessions focused on this. I can come back to this and maybe just focus on, they have like the endings that are masculine endings for these words, and then the feminine endings for these words. So one study session is the masculine, and then one study session is the feminine, and then I can go in again, and it's like I'm trying to see what else is here. So I can just take this one chapter and do it over time, or I can extensively practice and just go, okay, what's the most important part of this chapter, or what are some things that I really need to master. So like this section right here is all about countries. It's kuni no namae. And so like how to say Argentina and China and Spain. I can just focus on that because that's the most important thing for me. And everything else in this is like not as important. That would be my extensive. And then I move on to the next chapter. What is the most important part for this chapter? Okay, well, the next chapter, it talks a little bit about colors and the different ways to describe colors. Okay, I'm just going to focus on colors because I'm not really great at that. Now let's move on to the next one. That's extensive. You are quickly going through it. It's not an intense study session, whereas intensive, that word intense is in it, you are really staying with this and trying to get as much as you can before you move on. And so on TikTok as well, if you have any questions while I'm going through this, please drop them in the chat and I will be looking. I'm looking both on YouTube and over here on TikTok. So if I'm listening and I counter a lot of new words, which I don't know the meaning of, what do? I write each new word down and then look for the meaning in the bilingual monolingual dictionary. Okay. If you are finding a lot of words that you don't know the meaning of, the first question, and this is kind of what I've done I think I had a coaching session about this not too long ago. The first thing I would do is ask yourself, or I would ask you, what is the level of frustration that you can handle? Because for me, after looking up maybe 3 or 4 words in the language that I don't know, like new words that I don't know, I'm going to get so frustrated that I almost want to quit. That's a level of frustration that I can't handle. So what I might do is I might write those words down, and then in a separate study session, I would look at all of those words and look them up in the dictionary. If it's a language that I feel comfortable doing or using a monolingual dictionary, I'm going to go monolingual. So like Japanese is what I would do that for. Spanish, French, and to some extent Korean and Mandarin as well in some cases. I would use the dictionary in Spanish to explain to me in Spanish what this word is. And I would hesitate to look up the Spanish word, and get the English explanations of it. But if you don't feel comfortable or ready yet to do that, you can look it up in the bilingual dictionary. It's not wrong to do that. Sometimes, like for languages like German, Italian, and Russian, I look them up in either a German French dictionary or a German English dictionary. And then when I write them in my notes, I write the idea in French, or if I can in German, if there's a word I know that's similar. But my German and Italian are so beginner, it's rare for me to be able to do that right now. But I think the goal is less about like how do you write each word down, and more about what do you do after that. You wrote the word down, you know what it means now internalize it, right? So now that you have this list of vocabulary words, you have like tango and kotoba. So I don't know why Japanese is the one that keeps being pulled out as the language to talk about, but you have like word in Japanese. Now you got to start using it, and you have to hear it more often. So you might sit down and the list of words that you created, start to create some sentences. Write some sentences. Maybe you have the same sentence structure. I discovered a new word in a podcast. That's the sentence. I discovered a new word in a podcast. You replace word with words. I discovered new words in a podcast. Then you might change discover. I didn't discover new words in a podcast, or I was told new words in the podcast. Like you are playing around with and manipulating the sentence to help you really understand how this word is used. I think that's what helps to internalize it. Either getting the recognition practice, and usually a lot of people's go-to is flashcards for that. It's not my go-to for long term, but flashcard is definitely something that can help with recall and recognition. So you get that, you put the words in a flashcard set. It could be Quizlet, it can be, Memorize, or something that is a little bit more aligned with the long-term repetition, Anki. And you put those words in that flashcard set, and then you practice them over time. That is going to help you not just learn the word the first time, but practice the words and review the words. And even better, if you can get the sentence that word was used in and put that in your flashcard set as well. Again, rather than doing it in isolation. And then the other, sentence building or flashcards would be the ways that you can do mostly recall, but some recognition as well, especially if you're building the sentence. And then, or reverse that, mostly recognition, but a little bit of recall. The other way is using it in conversation. If you have people who speak the language or use the language, or you can go to websites like Hello Talk or Tandem. There's so many, or, Discord groups that I know of. You can start using it. I just learned this word here. Can we practice using it? I just want to make as many sentences as I can. Or you just tell them about the thing that you listen to and the words that you learned. It means this, and you can practice saying that in the language. Again, it strongly depends on so many different things, like your level of skill in that language. It depends on your confidence. It depends on your ability to explain around a word. I talk about that quite a bit too, because I think we focus so much on, I have to know a lot more vocabulary, when at least the way that I use my native language often. sometimes a lot of times, I forget the words. I forget the words of what I'm trying to say. We're like, oh, the thing, you know what I'm talking about, the thing that you do. And we describe the word that's missing. So if we're trying to describe like a strainer and we don't remember the word for strainer, we're like, the thing, like when you're in the kitchen and you're making pasta and you put it in it, it's like metal, and then the water comes out of it. Like, what is that called? Learning how to describe around the word is a natural way of using the language. And so don't feel like you need to learn every single vocabulary word that you come across that you don't know. Because there are tons of words that, like, for example, we read and we know when it's being used, but we have never really used ourselves. So it's a little tricky. There are tons of words that we know how to, like, we know when it's being used right or know when it's being used wrong, but we've never said out loud. So the pronunciation's a little weird. And then also ones that we actually know how to use, but only in certain situations. Like, actually, this is a word that just came up in, let me put this in so I can charge it. This is a word that just came up in a call with some of my business friends. And in one of the things that they wrote, they used the word articulate. And I immediately thought of what many people think of when they hear the word articulate, to articulate something, as like to talk, right? To express the idea clearly to someone else. I want to articulate this, right? But then I immediately remembered another meaning that I've never actually used out loud, but I was like, I read about this a few times. And articulate is also about the joints. And I was like, wait, is that really a thing? I had to look it up in the dictionary and double check. And I was like, yes, actually, articulate is about something about moving the joints. This is articulating, right? And so we don't know that if we don't use it in context. And we also don't know that if we don't use it repeatedly or come into contact with it repeatedly. Like, if I had only heard that once, I probably would forget. But the fact that I had read that so many times, or I'd heard it so many times, means that when it came up in this conversation, I was like, oh, wait, there's another meaning. And I think in a similar way, the first time I'd learned defenestrate, right? That's the word for to throw someone out of a window. And for me, I was like, I've never heard of this word before. How interesting. But then once I learned the word, it felt like it was coming up everywhere. It felt like everybody was talking about it online, or it's the spaces that I was in, or like, it would come up in a movie. And I'm like, wait, I'd never seen this word before. Now that's all I'm seeing. It's the exposure. You're getting the exposure to it. It's reinforcing the meaning. It's reinforcing how it's used. And so I think that's what it takes with learning a word. So you look it up. And again, in a monolingual or a bilingual dictionary. So which is better to look at, a word in a monolingual, which contains a definition, or a dictionary that contains synonyms of the same language? Ooh, depends on your goals. It depends on what you're trying to do. Are you just trying to... hold on. Because I just had another thought as I was talking. So and I'm trying to think of what I would actually do. So if I have a word that I don't know... Okay, if I'm sentence building, like trying to practice using it, I might look up synonyms to help me find other words I could use that are similar. And I might even unpack, how are these words used similarly? How are these words used differently? But strictly looking up the word to know what it means and maybe writing that down, I would use the monolingual dictionary that has the definition, because I just need to know what it means. Like, if I see this word and it pops up, I have a blank space in my mind as I hear the rest of the sentence. It's like, understood, blank, understood, right? In the sentence. I need to know what that blank is. So the dictionary is going to help me with that. But sometimes if I look it up in the dictionary and I still don't understand, I look up example sentences, I look up synonyms so I can get a better picture. And that actually ties into one of my favorite practice tasks and review tasks, which is word webs. I did not necessarily come up with this. I don't even know who came up with it, but the person that I heard talk about this quite a bit, and I've adopted it into my own language studies, is Ray from Gladly Global. And they talk a lot about sort of that word web mind map of using vocabulary. And so if you're trying to make stronger connections between that word and like what it means in your mind, I would use synonyms. So saying like a school, and then look up the synonyms for school, or for like to eat, and you might hear like gestate, right? Or to consume. And then you might sort of measure the differences and similarities between them. Is consume used in the same context as to eat? It gets really complicated, and I don't want you to sort of focus on that if it feels overwhelming. I would just default to, I found a word that I don't know. Let's look it up in the dictionary and figure out what it means. Let's write down that definition or write down the sentence. I think most of the time I write down a one word definition if I can. Like, I write the definition as small as I can if it's in another language other than the one I'm studying. So if it's Japanese, I try to write as short as I can in English, or I don't even define it. I write the sentence down so I can, when I look back at my notes, I'm not looking back at my notes to see the word, to see the sentence, and see the definition. I am forcing myself to look at the example again to go, do you recall it? Do you recall what this word means? And if I have to look it up in the dictionary again, that's more reinforcement for the languages that you're learning. And so I hope that answers the question. I know so much of what I share is like, it depends, but it really does, because learning a language, learning multiple languages is really a personal experience, and it depends on so many different factors, like the goals that you have, the habits you're trying to build, the things that you're trying to achieve, the milestones that you're setting for yourself, your experience with learning languages in general, your experience with learning languages like this one. So if you're learning an Asian language and you've learned one before, or you're learning a Romance language and you learned one before, or just learning a new thing. Maybe you've never learned a language before, but you have learned like programming, or you have learned an instrument, you have learned how to paint with oil painting, right? Those skills are transferable, but it really depends on your experience. And what I love to do when working with language learners is really pull in that information to say, okay, you have experience with piano, with playing piano, right? When you started learning piano, you started from square one. You may have listened to a lot of things in piano. You may have had that exposure to it, but you didn't put fingers to keys and start playing until, your beginning stage. And it took you a while to get to where you are right now. Same process for learning languages. It took repetition. It took practice. It took studying actively and passively, constantly coming into contact with the piano, with playing, so that you could use your skills, aka play the piano. And in the same way with it, when it comes to learning languages, it takes that repetition in order to get to where we want to be in the languages that we're learning. So I hope that is really helpful. And then the last thing I want to dive into before we end, still taking questions as they come up, both on TikTok and on YouTube, is we talked a little bit about it, but recall versus recognition. And so recall is your ability to sort of pull the information out, and recognition is being able to see it and understand what it means. And a lot of people focus more on recognition than recall. And what this causes is, it usually comes up for people when they're saying like, I can understand much more than I can say. It's because you focus more on recognition than recall, right? You focus more on your input skills than your output skills. And if your goal is to recall the information, to speak or to write, you have to focus on the output skills. You have to focus on the recall of pulling the information out and then using it, and not just using it randomly, but using it in a way that actually makes sense, that people actually understand. And so, for example, recall might be like trying to write down as many vocabulary words that you can from memory. Maybe you're saying all words that are related to studying, any word that comes to mind with studying. And that's where the word map, or the word map can come in, where you're just connecting all these words. Okay, this is the noun that relates to this word of school, and textbook, and then notebook, and pencil, and pen, any words that you can recall in the language. But the recognition is seeing all those words, like having the list in front of you and going, okay, what's this word? All right, next one. What's this word? Right? 2 different strategies, 2 different tasks. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to read more or listen more and understand what people are saying and writing, you probably want to focus on recognition, because when you see the words in the text, can you actually tell what they're saying? Or when you hear it in context of someone actually talking, can you understand what they're saying, versus if the word was said on its own? And a lot of times when the words are said together, we slur our words together, we blend sounds together. In comparison to when we say it in isolation, it's very clear, right? So It really depends on what you're trying to do, but I hope that this process of breaking down intensive and extensive study tasks, passive versus active learning, and recall versus recognition really helps you to understand that there isn't just one way to study, practice, or review a language. First, you got to decide, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to study right now and learn new information? Am I trying to practice the things that I've just studied? Or am I trying to review content that I studied maybe yesterday or last week or a month ago or, a quarter ago, a year ago? What is my goal? Am I trying to study, practice, or review? And then how do I want to do that? Do I want to actively study, actively practice, actively review? Do I want to passively practice, passively study, passively review? Do I want it to be really intensive? I want to stick with one thing for a long period of time because maybe this is a book you really want to understand, or a drama you really want to understand, or a conversation that you really want to practice and hone in on. So if you have a conversation partner or a teacher, you're like, I just want to keep talking about my family. I want to get really good at talking about me and my family. And so every time you meet, you're intensively focused on talking about family and talking about your family and you yourself. Versus extensively, you're like, today we're talking about my family, and tomorrow we're talking about my hobbies, and the next day we're talking about my language studies. You are hopping between different topics, or you are listening to lots of content, or you are reading lots of articles, and you're just focused on, how well did I do? What were some things that were a struggle? What were some things that I can improve on? What went well? We also want to focus on the wins and celebrate those. I literally yesterday just had a whole conversation with my members on celebrating our wins. We had a whole mindset reset on that. They voted for it. So celebrating wins is very, very important. But yeah, recall or recognition. And recall and recognition, I guess I'm trying to think this out loud because I don't think I've ever talked or thought about this before. But I think recall can be passive and active as well. And I'm trying to make sure I define it to see if that's true. So like, passive recall might be, if I'm listening to a podcast and I'm just trying to get the gist out of it. That one's a little shaky. I don't know if I would blend those two. I'm sure it's possible, but me trying to do like off the cuff, something I never really thought about before. But now I'm like, I want to dive into that. And I might break that down a little further for members. I'm gonna write that down. Where's my stuff? Recall and recognition. Passive versus active. Yeah, I want to dive into that a little more and try to get some examples. But yes, I think this is the end of our little conversation. I told you I had a lot to share today, but I hope that this was really helpful. So if you found this video helpful, whether you're watching on TikTok or on YouTube, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, tap the screen on TikTok so it gets lots of likes. And don't forget to follow and subscribe so that you can get more content like this. I am hoping, my goal is to have something for you every Wednesday, whether it is a live stream with me like this, or it's a video that I have uploaded on Wednesdays. That is the thing that I am working really hard to do. And this is week 2 of live streams. So if you want to make sure you don't miss it, make sure to follow me everywhere, and also just subscribe, because I post the messages like on Threads and on my Instagram. Like, I make sure that people know as soon as possible, but I don't really have a set time for it quite yet. But that's it. That's all of my things. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to first say goodbye to people over on TikTok. Thank you so much for being here. And then I am going to say goodbye to the people over on YouTube. Again, thank you so much. And a special thanks to all of those amazing questions that we got in the chat. Really appreciate those. And if you're watching this later in the replay, or when it's up on my channel, because I'm going to leave it up in the live tab, you can ask your questions in the comments, and maybe that might be the topic of a new video. Who knows? But thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week, either live or in a recording. Bye-bye.